Well, it's now come time for me to actually give my final message while I'm here at Woodmen Valley Chapel. And I've thoroughly enjoyed my time here, and it's been wonderful being able to getting to know some of you and to be able to engage with some of you and try and answer some of your questions. I do have a pile of cards in my room, which is about this thick, some of which have email addresses on, and I'd just like to assure you that once I get back, we will have someone email you answers to the questions if we didn't actually get the opportunity to pluck them out of the basket and deal with them. So we've dealt with a series of fairly difficult questions over the course of this weekend. And this particular question is one that obviously is actually deeply troubling in many ways, which is, if God is a God of love, and Christians claim that they worship a God of love, why is it at times that the church is accused of such gross arrogance and indeed is seen to be so deeply arrogant? And so I want to cut straight to the quick here. Basically say, if you have Christian friends who are deeply offensively arrogant, then I would like you to make some new Christian friends. It's time to move on, and hopefully you'll find many of those people here in this church. Now, ever since I became a Christian, having been raised, spent most of my childhood in Islamic cultures, and then becoming a Christian, I actually fell in love with the church. And actually that's a love affair that's remained even to this day. Now, the church is my family. And the trouble is, though, sometimes family, we do get it wrong and we mess up. So I would also like to begin this evening by saying to you that if you have been hurt, if you have been abused or used by the church, then I would actually like to apologize to you. One of the reasons why it's a delight for us to partnership with this church here is this is also a church that is interested in people. And that may not necessarily be the case. As a matter of fact, there's a very interesting study that's been published through the University of Oxford by actually a non-Christian person on the state of the church and what it stands for. And even though this book, Oxford University Press publication, is not written by a Christian and not written by someone who I think understands necessarily exactly what the Christian church is about, a lot of what they have to say is sadly true. And that is a source of concern. So what I would like to try to do is, we're going to spend some time looking at what Jesus Christ actually had to say about this whole issue of self-righteous arrogance. And it's quite interesting how he spoke into it so clearly and so powerfully. Now, before doing that, there are a couple of other questions I'd just like to deal with, because if we don't understand them, then the chances are that we may then misunderstand other things that Jesus Christ is actually saying. Now, there are three levels, I guess you could say, at which people struggle with this whole issue of, is the Christian faith inherently arrogant? And there are some issues on which I would want to try to offer a defense, if you like, or an explanation. Now, the first one is at the philosophical level. Now, the way this accusation works is, look, because the church claims that it has the truth and that it believes the truth, it must therefore be arrogant, because it's saying, therefore, by definition, that other people are going to be wrong if they disagree with it. Now, we have here to bear in mind the fact that many of the complications that we wrestle with in relationship to this particular question are pictorial. I can remember speaking at a dinner a few years ago in London, and I gave a short talk, and then I opened myself up for questions. And the first question this guy asked me was, look, he said, the trouble with you Christians is you think you've got the only way. He said, but there is this mountain, and there are different paths that go up the mountain, and they all go to the top. And you're on the Christian path, and other people are on this path or that path or whatever path. They're all on different paths, and they all go to the top of the mountain. He said, why can't you accept that? So I looked at him, and he looked a fairly fit man, like he might exercise and do other things which aren't that good for you. And have you ever noticed how people who are very fit are always pulling muscles? I mean, the number of professional athletes who are bandaged up, it just goes to show how unhealthy it is. And I looked at him and I said, have you ever climbed to the top of a mountain? And he said, well, yes, I have. Numerous times. I said, very well. I said, when you were standing on the top of the mountain, could you see where all paths from the base led? And he shook his head. He said, no. I said, very well. Where would you need to be standing? If you can't see where all paths from the base lead, if you're standing on the top, where do you need to be standing to know all paths from the base lead to the summit? And he said, well, up here. I said, well, who's the only person who has that view? And he paused, he said, God. I said, well, who are you claiming to be when you tell me that all paths from the base go to the top? At this point, he looked a bit surprised. I said, you wouldn't happen to have next week's natural lottery numbers, would you? Because if you are God, those numbers could be very useful to me. There are some pictures that we bring to bear on this issue, which initially sound like they could actually be very humbling, very leveling. But the more you reflect and think on them, the more problematic they actually become because of the claim that's actually built within it to actually make the picture work. It is true that if you assert one thing is true, that you may be excluding other things. So it is necessarily the case, for example, that if you say all paths lead to God, you are saying that those who believe that only some paths lead to God or only one path leads to God are wrong. I can remember just after I became a Christian, I had the honor of the country I was living in of meeting the leader of the faith, of the Baha'i faith. And I had no idea what the Baha'i were. I'd only been a Christian for a day, and I met this guy, and he just introduced himself to me, and I said, well, I've just become a Christian. He said, well, that's wonderful. He said, I'm the leader of the Baha'i here. I said, well, what do you believe? He said, well, we believe that all paths lead to God. And I said, well, I think only one path leads to God. He said, no, we can't accept that. I said, so you exclude me then? He said, no. We want to include everybody and everything. I said, well, what about the statement that there's only one way to him? He said, no, we couldn't possibly accept that. I said, you're excluding me again. Now, here's the problem. If you say all paths lead to God, you are saying that those who say only some paths lead to God or only one path lead to God are wrong. If you say only some paths lead to God, because you're not so sure that Adolf Hitler had such a great idea after all, that only some paths lead to him, you are saying that those who believe all paths lead to him or only one path leads to him are wrong. Now, that's just the way it works. Now, it's maybe disappointing that when we use the word self-righteous, we automatically equate that with arrogance. And actually, that's not correct. Because you can actually be humbly self-righteous. And you can be arrogantly self-righteous. That is actually a different question. Similarly, you can be humbly wrong and humbly right. The very fact that you are claiming, though, that something is true may not necessarily say very much about the attitude that is brought to bear. But the attitude is very, very important because all of us would recognize arrogance as being an intrinsically ugly moral quality that could be attributed, that we wouldn't want to associate with us whatsoever. But the very fact that you are claiming something to be true doesn't necessarily mean that you are pegging yourself to a claim that may necessarily be arrogant. That's just the way the truth works. Now, of course, there is a moral level to this question, and that goes much deeper. I remember speaking at an event a few years ago, and a lady came up to me, and in this particular event, I actually only gave a talk for about 10 minutes, which I'm sure many of you would wish would be the case now. But there, what I did, I talked for 10 minutes, and I did an hour and a half of questions and answers. And at the end of the meeting, a lady came up to me, and she said, look, can I ask you some more questions? I said, well, please go ahead. She said, well, look, I'm a Buddhist. And she said, and there is something that you seem to be assuming in your answers that you gave to other people, but it didn't come out explicitly because you weren't asked, and I just want to clarify. And I said, okay, go ahead. Well, she said, you seem to think that there is only one way to God, and that would be through the person of Christ. I said, yes. She said, well, I could never be a morally intolerant person like you and say other people are wrong. So I looked at her and I said, you're a Buddhist? She said, I am. I said, tell me, did not the Buddha say that the Hindus were wrong? Did not the Buddha say that the Vedas are not the divine revelation of God, and that the caste system, which is at the center of Hinduism, is evil? And her mouth fell open and she said, he did say that. I'd read it this morning in my devotions. So I said, well, my question to you is this. If you're prepared to follow the Buddha, even though he says other people are wrong, why are you not prepared to follow Christ when he says other people are wrong? And she looked at me and she said, I don't like where this is going. Now again, I said, I appreciate the comment. I said, I appreciate the insight. I said, but, I think my question is probably going to have to remain. Now, of course, I guess what lies behind all of this is something that deals with attitude. There was a professor at the University of Oxford many years ago called Professor Isaiah Berlin. He was a polymath. He was an expert in so many different areas. He was hugely esteemed and revered, indeed maybe one of the dominant figures at the University of Oxford. As a matter of fact, I can remember once speaking in a college at Oxford, and I didn't actually realize that this had actually at one point been his college. And one of the people at the top table afterwards said to me, you know, I knew Isaiah Berlin. And the trouble was he was so popular and so esteemed, we weren't sure of the true lasting impact of his work because, you know, we were all caught up in simply, you know, the name recognition that he had at the time. Now, Isaiah Berlin wrote about many different subjects. He came from a Jewish background. He was quite secular in his outlook. And he wrote a lot about politics. He wrote a lot about political freedom. He wrote a lot about how we should understand what it means to live in a free society. And in one of his essays, he says this. And he's talking about pluralism. Now, as he frames pluralism, to him, pluralism is what is absolutely essential to maintain a free society. So what he says is this. He says, the enemy of pluralism is monism, the ancient belief that there is a single harmony of truths into which everything, if in the end it is genuine, must fit. The consequence of this belief, which is something different from but akin to what Karl Popper called essentialism, to him the root of all evil, is that those who know should command those who do not. To cause pain, to kill, to torture, are in general rightly condemned. But when these things are not done for my personal benefit, but for an ism, socialism, nationalism, fascism, communism, fanatically held religious belief, or progress, or the fulfillment of the laws of history, then they are in order. And then he goes on to say, monism is one step away from despotism. You should try saying that word after you've had 1 hour, 45 minutes sleep the night before. I just realized it's harder than I thought. Monism is one step away from despotism. You see what he's saying? If you believe you have the truth, you will eventually convince yourself that you can use whatever means are necessary to command those who do not know that truth. And if you dress it up in a system, then there is untold misery that you can inflict on other people. I can remember reading through this essay and writing at the bottom of it just one sentence. What about a truth that's filled with grace? You see, when you say that someone is graceful, you're saying that there is a beauty to their physical movement. When you say that someone is gracious, you are saying there is a beauty to their inner movement. Jesus Christ was described as someone who was full of truth and grace. Is it possible to hold on to the truth while being filled with grace? Now, there are many accusations that can be leveled against the church. Some of them, at certain times, may indeed be true. Now, what is interesting is ever since the Christian faith started, ever since its birth, there has been a concern about how do we tell and how do we help preserve what might be a true gospel as opposed to a false gospel, and what might be a true Christian as opposed to a false Christian. Because neither Christ, nor the Apostle Paul, or any of the early disciples were willing to admit the fact that just because someone claimed to be Christian meant that they were. Even Jesus Christ said that on the final day of judgment, people will come to him and stand before him, and say, did we not do miracles in your name? Did we not feed the poor in your name? Did we not do all of these things in your name? And Jesus will look at them and say, I never knew you. Not, I once knew you and you went off on your own little way. I never knew you. Those are sobering words. Now, when you read the New Testament, there's a debate, academic debate, about which is the oldest book of the New Testament. In other words, which was written first. Now, hard to be sure, but one of the books that's up there with a shot of being one of the first pieces of Christian literature is the book of Galatians. Now, we can't be 100% sure, but, more likely than not, one of the first pieces of Christian literature that you can read, in terms of if we were to arrange what was written in the New Testament chronologically, would be the book of Galatians. Now, the author of that letter has many concerns, but one of them is this: how do you tell a true Christian from a false one? And he actually offers a test. He says, look, if someone is a Christian, there should be a fruit in their life. Now, this fruit is in the singular, but the flavor it has is a compound flavor. And the Apostle Paul says this is what the fruit should taste like. It should taste of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. What the Apostle Paul is basically saying is, bite me. Now, he's saying it in a very polite way. He's basically saying, look, if someone claims to be a Christian, or as I claim to be a follower of Christ, come and taste the fruit in my life. This is what it should taste of. If, on the other hand, what you taste is anger, malice, lust, greed, and so on, well, that fruit is not in keeping with what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. In other words, Paul is saying to the Galatians, look, you not only have the ability, you have the right to question the reality of anyone who claims to follow Jesus Christ based on the fruit that you see in their life. There are all kinds of reasons why people may claim the title Christian. It could be to feed a sense of nationalism, or because it's helpful for their business, or may gain them an extra few votes. But claiming the title in no means tells us about the reality of what is going on. That actually has to be tasted and tested. I can remember on one of the occasions when I went to speak in Washington, D.C., to a group of people in the White House, and they said, what would you like to speak on? And I'd been there a few times before, and I said, well, you've had me, you want me to suggest something? And she said, well, where have you been recently? I said, well, I met with some of the guys from the Taliban, and I talked to them. Why didn't I give the message I gave to the Taliban to you? Depending on your view on politics, it's more or less the same sort of moral plane. And the person said, this is a great idea. Now, I can remember I had a lot of fun that morning, and it was a huge privilege to be in that place, especially when you consider the British almost burnt it down back in the 1800s. Though the Secret Service never let me out of their sight. And afterwards, several hours afterwards, I met up with someone for lunch. A wonderful Christian person. And we got talking, and I said, I'd like to ask you a hypothetical question. I said, let's supposing I said to you over lunch, it went really well this morning, and so I'm going to move to Washington, D.C., and I'm going to set up a Christian ministry based here, and I'd like you to come and work for me. And this person at that time was described as being one of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C., and I always find it interesting that that label, the most powerful person in Washington, D.C., is never the president. But anyway, that's a whole other issue. I said, so let's suppose I extended that offer to you. My question to you is this: what are the questions that you would ask before agreeing to come? Now, I found the response of this person, it was a woman actually, Fascinating. First question. How much prayer really goes on in your organization? You claim to be Christian. How much time do you spend on your knees before Him? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Question number 2. How do you treat your junior staff? Now, at that point, I remember looking at them saying, okay, I said, I understand question number 1. I think it's a very good question. I said, help me understand question number 2. She said, well, the philosophy in this city is you kiss up and you bite down. She said, I've stood in the Oval Office waiting for the president to come. Sometimes with people I would consider to be my heroes, sometimes Christian heroes. And I've seen the way they've talked to their junior staff. I've seen the words they used. I've seen the things they've said. And you have no idea how disappointed I have been. They're not even aware that I'm in the room because I'm not important enough in their eyes. When the president walks in, it's all sweetness and light, and we would like to petition you on this and bring this before you. And then when he walks out, all of a sudden the switch is flicked. And then we see this other side again. I would want to know, she said, what your junior staff have to say about you as a person. It's an interesting question, isn't it? If you are sitting here this evening and you are a Christian, you need to know that we are called to a very high standard. And when we fail, we have to apologize and say sorry. If you are sitting here and you are not a Christian, maybe there's something about the Christian faith that attracts you, but you're just not so sure about some of the Christians you've met, I'd like to implore you. Just because someone claims to be something doesn't mean that they are. You have to look at the fruit, look at the reality. What is actually there? Now, having made these largely introductory comments, what I would like to do, if I could with you, is simply look at something that Jesus Christ himself actually said. And it's not easy to read. It's found in the Gospel of Luke, and this is what it says. It says, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself, God, I thank you I'm not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I just have to say, if you work for the IRS, this has never been a popular profession. I fast twice a week, and I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. What is Jesus trying to say here? Let me try to put this saying of Christ back into the context in which he spoke it. 2 men went to the temple to pray, he said. Now, in every Semitic language, when you say someone goes to the temple to pray, it means one of 2 things. 1, they're going to go on their own, and they're going to just, offer a private prayer. 2, they're going to a public act of worship, a bit like this. There'll be lots of people there. It's the same phrase that you use. Okay, the context allows you to discern which of the 2 it is. This is almost certainly 100% sure a public act of worship. I'll come back to that in a minute. The reason we can be so sure is because of what the tax collector prays. But I say we'll come back to that in a minute. So they go to church. They go to the temple. The Pharisee, who is a religious leader, and if this helps you picture it, the upright, pastor, and he stands somewhere near the front, because obviously that's where he should be. And he basically says, God, you made me better than everybody else. Isn't that great? Now, the Pharisees had a little pegging order. Now, they hated tax collectors. I don't have time to go into it now. It's really not that important. But suffice to say that tax collectors were seen as people who completely sold out as far as they were concerned, to the enemy. As a matter of fact, the Pharisees had a saying that they would rather their daughters marry dogs than tax collectors. And so this religious leader is standing up at the front in this big service, and he basically says, God, you have made me better than everyone else. I don't want to say too much about this prayer, apart from the fact that it is steeped in arrogance. It is also steeped in self-righteousness. But please be careful here. Remember, you can be humbly self-righteous, and you can be arrogantly self-righteous. Now, he is arrogantly self-righteous. The idea of being self-righteous is that you can make yourself right. I know this is a very complicated grammatical point, but that's what the idea of self-righteousness means. Okay, that by whatever you do, you can make yourself right with God. The opposite of self-righteousness, as we're about to learn as Jesus speaks here, is having someone else make you right. Now, you can have someone else make you right. Does that make sense? It's not self-righteousness, it's like other righteousness, and you can be arrogant about it, or you can be humble. Similarly, you can be self-righteous, and you can be humbly self-righteous, because I'm a nice person, I'm kind to, I was going to say kind to granny, you probably don't use that phrase here. You know, you help old ladies cross the street, and so on. You know, that you should go to be with God forever. And you can be humble about it, or you can be arrogant about it. It's slightly unfortunate that we equate self-righteousness automatically with arrogance, although the two often do go hand in hand together. Now, this guy is incredibly arrogant. I'm better than everybody else, and God, you yourself, I'm sure, can't wait to have me come and join you. The tax collector, however, he stands somewhere near the back. Now, his actions are very interesting, especially if you've been raised in the Middle East. He would not look up to heaven, which is a strange thing, because when you pray, in Jewish circles, you stand and you look up to heaven, like this. Now, I know if you're like a good Anglican, you get down on your knees and you pray looking down at the floor. Now, if you want to make a geographical statement about where heaven, hell is, so on, and where you're directing your prayers. But anyway, the idea is that you stand and you look up to heaven. He won't look up. He looks down. And he beats his breast. Now, this is remarkably strange. Women beat breasts in these cultures, not men. It's a sign of deep remorse. And if you see any of the funeral scenes, of which are piling out of the Middle East even to this day, you will often see the women will be there beating their breasts like this, crying, because that's what women do to show remorse. And the men, well, in the current culture, they shoot their guns into the air and various other things. There's only one other instance in the Gospel of Luke you'll see a man beating his breast, because this is something only women do. And it's with one of the disciples when Jesus Christ is hanging on the cross, and he's so disturbed by what he sees, he beats his breast. This guy is both utterly ashamed and in a state of deep remorse. And he prays, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Except that's not exactly what he prays. Okay, it's an okay English translation. It's not quite accurate. Now, if you were good Anglicans, I go to an Anglican church. I guess over here it's Episcopalian, right? So I go to a very unusual Anglican church where people actually believe in God. But if you were raised in that tradition, you might be familiar with something called the Kyrie eleison. Does anyone here know what it is? If you've never heard of the Kyrie eleison, just put up your hand if you've never heard of it. Don't be ashamed. Oh, shame on you. Now, this little piece of liturgy in the service is actually just taken from the Greek of the New Testament, Kyrie eleison, which means Christe eleison, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. And you just repeat it. Sounds great, most people don't have a clue what they're saying. Now, that little word eleison, that is the Greek word for mercy. So, that's how you would ask God for mercy. That is not actually what this man prays. What he actually prays, if you read it in the original Greek of the text in which the Gospel of Luke was written, what he actually prays is halassotoimoi, which if we were to translate almost directly into English would say, be propitious to me. Now, what does that mean? This is why we can be almost certain that this context of this story, as Jesus tells it, is in the context of public worship. Every day in Jerusalem, at daybreak and at dusk, there is a religious service. Every day in the temple, a lamb is killed for the forgiveness of sins. Now, once that sacrifice has been offered, the priest who's done the sacrifice, he turns around and he walks off, like back away from everybody, through a curtain, and he goes and he burns incense on the other side, and he prays to God for the nation. At that point, no one else can see what's happening. It'll be like me completely walking off the stage, and it'll just be empty. Now, what would you do? Now, most of you would check your BlackBerries. Shame on you. But before the invention of BlackBerries, iPhones, or any other invention of the devil, when that happened and there was nothing to do, the people prayed. So if you read Luke chapter 1, you'll read about a guy called Zechariah. And it says when it fell to Zechariah's lot to burn incense, he went in to burn incense in the temple, and everyone stood outside praying. Because that's what you do. There's nothing to see. That is the liturgy. That is the space. Provision is made for the forgiveness of sin. A sacrifice is offered so that sins can be forgiven. The priest goes in to burn incense. A religious leader who is there at the service says, "Look at me, I'm better than everybody else." And a tax collector stands at the back, beats his breast, looks down at the floor, and he says, "May this propitiation, may this sacrifice, may it be for me." Jesus says, "I tell you that this man went home having been justified rather than the other." Now, this is remarkable. This great religious leader, whom everyone would respect, we have to understand how respected this person would be. This would be the person you'd want to be seen having Sunday lunch with. This is the person you would want to be present at significant events in your life. This is the person you would want to claim connection to. This is the person who everybody would say, without a shadow of doubt, is the one that A, that God loves the most, and B, he's definitely going, even though we don't like him. And the one man who everybody thinks has not a single chance of being there, Jesus Christ says, he receives justification from God. He is justified by God. He is made right by God. He's not making himself right. He's not self-righteous. He knows that he needs to receive something that he cannot provide himself, and he receives it. A provision for forgiveness is made, and he prays, "May that be for me." I tell you that that man rather than the other went home justified before God. For everyone who humbles himself will be exalted, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. The Christian faith is inherently humbling. It's not accidentally humbling. It's not incidentally humbling. It is inherently humbling. It doesn't say that in order to get to heaven, what we need to do is hold ourselves to a higher moral standard, tell everybody else where to get off, and make sure that everybody knows how great we are before him. That is not what it is about. Now, I've touched on this subject Friday night, Saturday night, twice Sunday morning, and now Sunday evening. That is because I am what is called an evangelist. That basically means I have one message and 3 different ways of delivering it. This is now my 5th attempt. This is concerning to me. There is no room for pride in the Christian faith. It's impossible. There is no room for boasting in the Christian faith. It is excluded. As a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul himself says it is excluded. Precisely because of teachings like this. Now, it's surprising, because a lot of people think that the Apostle Paul is one of the most arrogant Christians ever to walk the face of planet Earth. And if you were here for one of the Sunday morning services where we quoted Richard Dawkins, that's exactly what Richard Dawkins thinks of the Apostle Paul. Now, why does everybody think he's so arrogant? Well, the answer is simple. The Apostle Paul is absolutely sure that he is going to heaven. Now, imagine this. You've been here this weekend. You think, I've got a few more questions for you, Michael. If I get a few friends together around a breakfast table or a lunch table, will you come and talk to them? And I say, yeah, sure, I'll be very happy to. So a group of friends are gathered around the table. And after we've had coffee or sandwiches or whatever it is, I sort of clear my throat. And I say, well, it's great to see you all here today. I would like to start off by saying to you that I know for sure, 100%, that I am going to heaven. Now, how does that make me sound? So again, this is why I like Pentecostal churches. It's the feedback that I appreciate. Arrogant, self-righteous, you name it. Put whatever word you want in there. What makes me think I'm good enough? What really makes me think I'm so much better than everybody else that I can be so sure? But you, I'm not so sure about. There are only so many ways of giving this analogy, so let me just give a slightly different one. But it's all the same. Matt Hurd, who's one of the pastors here and who was welcoming you earlier, let's supposing Matt and I, we get to know each other, we enjoy some kind of relationship, fellowship with each other. But there comes a time where, I don't know, for whatever reason, one of us offends the other one. Now, there are a couple of things that can happen. We could go separate ways. We could pretend to like each other. Some churches are specialized in this particular field. Or we could fight about it. Other groups are specialized in that. But what ultimately needs to happen is there needs to be a process of forgiveness. Whenever relationships have been broken, they can only be restored through a process of forgiveness. Now, if I have offended him, and he is willing to forgive me, and I am willing to say I am sorry and receive his forgiveness, he and I are back in relationship. Now, let's supposing you come and you say to me, Michael, do you know Matt Hurd? And I say, I'm not sure. You say, well, tall guy, gingery hair, trendy clothes, sort of the fashion-conscious version of you. And I say, I don't know. And you say, he introduced you Friday night, Saturday night, twice on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, you had lunch with him on Sunday. And I say, I'm not sure I'm not sure. Wouldn't you think that was strange? Let's suppose you came and said to me, Michael, do you know Matt? And I say, yeah, sure, we're good friends. You would never turn to me and say, how can you be so arrogant to say that? It's not a question of arrogance. It's a question of relationship. It's something I either enjoy or I don't. It's either something we're currently in or we're not. It's not a question of arrogance. Now, how can I be so certain about it? How can I be so sure? How can I be so persuaded? And the answer is, well, if there's nothing between us, and even if there has been something between us and we've overcome it, and there's been forgiveness offered and confession at the other side, well, we're in it. I know him. It's just that simple. When the Apostle Paul talks of being sure of going to heaven, it's not because he has intellectually figured everything out. It's because of a relational position he's been placed in with Christ. Christ was willing to forgive. He was willing to receive it. That's exactly what happens here. But it is inherently humbling. You cannot receive someone's forgiveness unless you're willing to say sorry. That is the really annoying thing about forgiveness. I mean, it's so distressing. It's the thing I like about it the least. You have to say, you were wrong. That was the greatest problem in the first 10 years of my marriage. I was never wrong. I'm a professional Christian apologist. I could persuade my wife almost to anything. It is a relational barrier. It's not about a question of I'm making myself right to her or justifying myself right to her. The issue is, when I'm wrong, am I prepared to say sorry? And the difficulty is, it is just so humbling. It's annoying. Now, all of us have natural traits. I'm not sure if humility is my most natural trait. I hope that it increasingly becomes so. You cannot come to God through self-righteousness. You cannot earn favor with him. There is nothing you can do to put yourself in a position where he will welcome you. All you can do is receive the forgiveness that he offers, the provision that he makes, and it is inherently humbling. I don't know what it means for each of you as you look at the Christian faith. It's very, very interesting how we can often become so defensive, or how we can create an impression that we're stronger than we are. Now, the trouble within the church has been that if you stand in front of a group of people like this tonight and you say, look, I make mistakes like everybody else and I need as much forgiveness as you, we have what I call a pedestal problem. We tend to put our leaders on a pedestal anyway. You know, we lift them up, we make them greater than they actually are. Then they come and say, I'm just an ordinary guy like you and I need just as much forgiveness as you, and everyone goes, isn't that great? And they make the pedestal a bit taller. And so humility becomes something that actually builds the pedestal higher and higher. Does that make sense? As opposed to an honest recognition to the fact that actually we're all in the same boat. We're all struggling with the same issues. We're all guilty of the same or similar sins before God. We all need forgiveness. He's made a provision. We all need to avail ourselves of it. That is a great leveler. As I said when I started, if you have been offended by the church, I am deeply and desperately sorry. Please don't confuse the fact that even though Christ claims to have the truth, to be the truth, to know the truth, and to give us the truth, that there's something inherently arrogant in that. That's just about truth. You can be humbly truthful and arrogantly truthful. Please don't confuse the exclusivity that he brings as being arrogant. And please most certainly do not understand the gospel as being anything other than what it is meant to be. Something that brings every man and every woman to his knees, or to their knees, before him, in recognition that we've all done things wrong. We all need to be forgiven by him. He is willing to forgive. And if we receive it, we're made right, and we're put in the right position with him. I, in my travels, have been able to meet an awful lot of Christian leaders. One of the reasons I like working for the organization I work for is the more I've got to know Ravi Zacharias, the more I realize how genuine the man is. Now, I wish I could say that's true for everybody. It's not. I can remember being 14 years ago now, traveling with him, and a Christian film crew came. And they said, we'd like to make an interview with him, and they were interviewing various other people. And I had nothing else to do. I was just along for the journey, carrying bags. And so I went down an hour earlier, because I've seen these guys set up before, and I know they have a lot of equipment, and it takes ages for them to set up. And I said, do you need a hand? So I just carried all the equipment out of the van and helped set it up, and all the lights and all the chairs. And when everything was finally ready and the cameras were set up to roll, gave him a quick buzz on his phone and said, okay, why don't you come down? And he came down, and they interviewed him for 45 minutes, and then he talked to them for 10 minutes afterwards, and then he went back up to prepare for his message that evening. And I said to the guys, you want me to help pack up? And as we're packing up, one of the camera guys said to another one of the camera guys, we've done almost 100 of these interviews so far. This is one of the few genuine articles I've come across. That's incredible. Those of us who are believers in this auditorium tonight need to understand that people are looking at us, and they want to know whether it makes any difference if you follow Christ or not. And the answer is it should make every difference. It shouldn't be that rare. I'd just like to ask a few questions myself, and then I'm going to... Actually, no, I can't. We're 7:17. We're meant to finish at 7:03. Isn't that disappointing? Let me just make one challenge. It is not unreasonable for the non-Christian world to look at the church and ask the question, what on earth is going on inside? What is the fruit? A year ago, I was with a guy called John Bechtel. He's telling me a story of He was the last foreign missionary, he and his father, to be thrown out of China when communism took root there and all the missionaries got shut down. He lived in Hong Kong for a while. When he was living in Hong Kong, he thought, what can I do? And he realized there's a lot of orphans. So he thought, I'll set up an orphanage. Then he thought, okay, I need a building. So he went around, and he suddenly realized that he'd been to school with the governor of Hong Kong, because he went to a British school. So he thought this will be easy. He went to the governor of Hong Kong and said, I need a building to start up an orphanage. The guy said, no. So he said, please? He said, no. That didn't work. He tried various other things. That didn't work. A friend of his came and said, I've got a plan for you. I've prayed for you, and I tell you what, why don't you come to North America, give a series of talks about what you want to do, and I believe you will raise all the money that you need to raise to buy an orphanage. And at this point, he'd found a building that was for sale. It was a boarding school that had been built and then immediately shut down. So he came over, he did a speaking tour. He came back to Hong Kong. 2 weeks later, he received an envelope. He opened it, and it was a letter with another envelope. The letter was from his friend. The letter simply said, Dear John, in this letter are all of the gifts that have been made to help you purchase an orphanage to look after the homeless as a result of your speaking tour. He opened up the letter, and in it was a note from an 11-year-old girl with a $1 bill, which basically said, Dear John, I get 10 cents pocket money a week. I've been saving it up. I came to church and heard you talk about the fact that you'd like to buy an orphanage for those little girls, and I would like to help you buy it. Here's my $1. John was holding this envelope, thinking what he should do, and he was suddenly reminded of the simple fact that he thought he'd been promised that everything he needed to buy the orphanage would be given to him as a result of this tour. So he went to the caretaker of the building and handed him the letter and said, this is my offer to buy this building. The caretaker opened it, read the note, looked at the $1 bill, and burst out laughing. and gave it back. John speaks fluent Chinese. He's quite a big guy. He's even taller than me. He put on his sternest face and looked at the caretaker and he said, "Unless you pass on this offer to your owner, I will report you to the authorities." Because by law, since there's a for sale sign outside the building, he has to pass on every offer, otherwise he's guilty of a crime. The caretaker said, "If that's the way you want it, fine." A week later, he rings John. He says, "My owners would like to meet with you." And they agreed to sell the building to him for $1. 25 years later, John's back in North America. He's telling this story. And after he's finished speaking, a woman who's about 36, 37 years of age comes up to him and says, "That was me. That was my $1 I sent you." John rushed out into the car parking lot and he tried to stop as many people leaving the church as he possibly could, and he called them back in and introduced them to this woman. And then suggested it would be awfully nice if maybe they sent her to Hong Kong so she could see what she had purchased. So $50,000 was raised then and there, which is much more than you need for an airfare to Hong Kong. So she went to Hong Kong and she passed on the money. $1. That girl gave everything that she had, everything, for the gospel. And thousands of lives have been changed. What are we holding back from as Christians in terms of how we should be living for the sake of the gospel? Because we're so desperate to hold on to what we have, and we're not prepared to live in the ways that He calls us and He directs us. My challenge this evening is primarily for the church. We need to live in a manner worthy of the calling we have received. And if you don't know Him, I would urge you to turn to Him. He can do the most amazing things in you and through you. Please forgive us where we have failed. But God sets us on the most exciting journey, and it can change our lives forever. Well, you've listened very well, and we're now 20 minutes over, so I better stop talking, otherwise they decrease my honorarium. And so I get in trouble with my boss. I've really enjoyed my time with you. You may not have done that. That's why I've taken the liberty and spoken so much longer tonight, because I'm feeling more relaxed, and I'm just happy that I've been here. We're now going to do some Q&A, so Matt's going to come up and do that. You can ask any question you want to. I'll do my best to answer it. Okay? Any question that bothers you. Does the light go off when you close the fridge door? Write it down, we'll answer it. Get in the fridge, close the door, you'll soon find out. Don't do that with a chest freezer. Okay? That's not a good idea. So, Matt, why don't you come and take it from here, and we'll do some questions.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael. I've never even thought of that question, Michael. I've never wondered what happened inside the refrigerator. That's part of you, but I have wondered other things. So what we're going to do right now, you have been assembling questions, and we're going to figure out our timetable. I'll let you know here in just a moment. But we'll have a quick stand-up break. But before we do, pass your questions to the aisles in this direction, if you would. So, and then our ushers are going to come collect those. We'll put them all in a big basket, and then draw out a few. And in the meanwhile, you can just take a few minutes, stand, stretch your legs. We'll have a quick break, and then we'll get those questions going. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. And the bribes have begun. And thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and make a call. I know some of you will have schedule issues, but for your planning, we've gone over a little bit, so we're going to extend it 15 minutes and go to 8 o'clock. So if that's a problem, but no, there's a very informal environment here, and if you need to go, Michael and I will both talk about you with the mics on, but other than that, no one really paying any attention. So no, feel free. We want to respect your schedules, even though we didn't necessarily advertise when we would be finishing. So I guess that means we could go till 10 or 11, but we'll call it at 11. Actually, that was a Freudian slip, wasn't it? We'll call it at 8, and depending on where we are with that question, somewhere right around in there. So we'll go ahead and get started, and their bribery has occurred. Okay, so there are several chocolates. So here's one that is gift wrapped. So you get the question, I get the chocolate. Just kidding. If you're going to start eating that now, you have to share that with me if you do. Now, Michael, this morning you mentioned that.
My chocolate.
Well, no, I'm just going to wait and let you chew for a while and see if anything happens. If it's okay, then I might imbibe. This morning you mentioned that the 9/11 terrorists, quote, did not get away with it, end quote, and will be judged. Will they be judged for their sin or for what they perceived as good work, since all sins have been judged?
Okay, that's a very good question. If I'm understanding your question right, what I said is that in the morning is that one of the things that we can look forward to is the fact that we all do cry out for justice. And even when we think someone may have got away with something, or they haven't been brought to justice, that there is a time when God will actually exercise completely fair and absolute justice. And that actually then brings hope. Now, the question seems to have like a not yet element to it. So the question is, will they be judged for the sin or what they have perceived as good works? Now, what's slightly confusing here is it is true that what they are looking at within Islam is they see this as good work. Now, this is getting into quite complicated territory here. But depending on what school of Islam you're in, there was a criticism of the suicide bombers involved in the September 11th attacks, that the night before they flew their planes into the buildings, they were out sleeping with prostitutes and all that kind of stuff. And so some people said, well, that means therefore they can't possibly be good Muslims. But you have to understand what part of Islam they fall into. Within Islam, you are judged according to what you have done. Okay, 51% good, you get into heaven. 51% bad, you go to the other place. Right? Now, here's the thing. Most Muslims, because of the moral education they receive.
By the way, Michael grew up in Saudi Arabia, a significant part of his growing up years. So he grew up in an Islamic environment.
Yeah. So most of them will believe that if they are actually judged, they're more bad than good. That's because sometimes they're more honest than we are. Make sense? In other words, there was a youth survey done in Egypt, gosh, and that was quite a long time ago now, to 4,000 people aged between the age of 17 and 25. And one of the questions was, as a young adult in Egypt, what is the greatest issue you're wrestling with in your life? And there was a blank space, so there were no multiple choices, no boxes to tick, there was just a blank space. Over 80% of the respondents wrote the word guilt. Okay, that's my biggest problem. Now, here's the thing. If you keep promising yourself you're going to do good stuff and you don't, you're not going to actually get any better. As a matter of fact, it feels worse. I mean, because now you've broken the promise. So you did the bad thing and you broke your promise. So now you've done two things as opposed to one. However, if you die in jihad, so if you die in a spiritual struggle, which can involve taking the lives of other people who aren't good Muslims, that one act is of such supreme moral value, it outweighs everything else. Make sense? It guarantees you entrance to heaven. Now, the reason why every so often you'll see people on the TV in the Middle East saying, you know, especially when they want to sometimes threaten the West, you know, you do this to us and we'll send 1 million suicide bombers to you. The reason why they make those kinds of statements is they're saying, we can trade on this. We've got enough people in this culture who feel this way, and this is their ticket to eternal life. So that does then become problematic. So if I'm assuming I'm answering your question correctly, from a Christian point of view, it is the fact that, yes, there are two parts to this. Okay? There is what happens at the cross, Okay? But there is a judgment that will actually come, where what has happened at the cross will be applied. If you have received the forgiveness that he offers, you are forgiven. If you don't, well, then you will stand, in that sense, on your own 2 feet before him. And then that becomes very problematic. Now, if you were not here in the morning, I would recommend listening to Tom Tarrance's testimony, spelled T-A-R-R-A-N-T-S, C.S. Lewis Institute, for no other reason than he was a Christian terrorist. Okay? He was a Southern Baptist. As he said, I had my card punched, I was going to heaven. And the fact that he was killing people and blowing them up, as far as he was concerned, made no difference. Okay? Until one day he actually sat down and decided to read the Bible, there's a radical idea, and realized that he needed forgiveness from God. Okay? That he was lost. He was a sinner. So this is why I'm saying that the thing about claiming something in name is very, very, very dangerous. And it's something that we have to really, really steer away from. There are various elements within the question. I hope I've addressed it. You do have an email address here, so I will have someone email you at 007. What a cool email address. And allow you just to come back to me, just in case there's an aspect to this question that I'm missing.
What one book would you suggest, besides the Bible, that you could give non-believers?
Oh, wow. Gosh, it's hard, because it depends who they are. You know, it's really, really interesting. Christians want to be treated like individuals, and they want to treat everybody else the same. Okay? It doesn't work that way. Depending on where someone is, the questions that they have, the struggles that they're in, the things that they're coming with, will depend on what they're interested in, will depend on what it would actually be appropriate to give them. So the answer is there are loads of good books out there, and so I don't know, it's very hard to be more specific than that. Of course, when I write a book, that will be the book that you should give, that will work for everybody. And so, it's called Reflections on Humility.
So he did give me instructions, let the bribes work. So they are working. There you go. This one is almonds. How do you say that? Almonds.
Almonds.
Yeah. If Catholicism was the first denomination in Christianity, taught, given by Jesus, how is it acceptable that humans, in other words, the King of England, morphed Christianity into other forms that are also now considered true?
Huh. You know, this question reminds me of a time I was doing a Q&A in South Africa 2 days after the then Pope died, and the last question I took was, having decided that I wouldn't take any more, but then thought I'll take one more, was, has the Pope gone to heaven? So let me just say a couple of words about this. There are sorry, I have, it's the chocolate.
Here, take this chocolate away.
I think 007 poisoned me. So
That's why I was waiting.
The word Catholic has two meanings. Now, in one sense, with a small c, even if you're part of the Anglican Church, the Apostles' Creed, we believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, Catholic in the sense of universal. Now, we were actually talking about this at lunchtime. Sorry. I arrived here with a chest infection a week ago. And, it's gone. Okay. Actually, he's gone. I think I'm allergic to Matt. So we have to be careful how we understand this, because it is actually a little bit more complicated. There was one church. Now, around 500, there was actually a big split in the church. Now, I don't have time to go into that, but most of us aren't interested in that. We're interested in the church that happened about 500 years later than that, which is the one this refers to. And then in the 1500s, we had another huge split with what was called the Reformation, which basically means, working on that cycle, we're due some major event round about now. It's about every 500 years. So actually there was even a division before then, if you want to just take it from a church historical perspective. Now, some of these things are very sad, but they are sad for two different reasons. It's not the question about which church can trace back its lineage the furthest, as to which is genuine. That's not actually the test that we're given in Scripture. The test that we're given in Scripture by the apostles, by Christ, is very much to do with fruit and branches, and being able to see Christ in whoever it is claiming, to be a follower of him. Okay, that is the evidence that's what we're looking for. Okay, it's one of the key things that we're looking for. Now, what we're also looking for is, are they basically saying and teaching what Christ said? Now, there's a very sorry tale to be told here, and I wish I had a better one to tell. I actually think Rabbi Zacharias actually gives an overview of this very, very well if you've never seen the DVD series on Deliver Us from Evil. But the way he starts that out is that history tells a very unhappy tale of when the church has been married to political power. The church has always been at its most glorious, generally speaking, when it has struggled to provide for itself and everyone else around it. Or maybe it's been persecuted. Because the only reason for being part of the church under those conditions is that you are absolutely sure about who Christ is, about your identity in him. Because if it's going to cost you your life to go to church, I mean, you might get shot for going to church. You don't just go to church on a whim. Does that sort of make sense? The trouble is the more power we have, the more influence we have, the more affluence we have, the more we rely on ourselves and the less we rely on him. Now, this isn't something that's unique to church history. If you read the book of Ezekiel, especially, let's say, from chapters 14, 15, 16 in particular, it's a most amazing story. God basically comes to Israel through the prophet Ezekiel, and he says, look, you were like a naked, discarded baby, and I picked you out of the rubbish. I washed you, I raised you, I clothed you. You were made beautiful. I gave you wealth, and I gave you status. And then he makes the most incredible statement. He says, but you have traded on your fame and prostituted yourself because of your beauty. Literally, the very blessings that God gave them, they used to replace him. Now, this cycle repeats itself. The crucible for silver, the furnace for gold, but a man is tested by the praise he receives. We are tested more by our successes than by our failures. When we have success, the temptation is to rely on our own strength and use God when we get stuck, rather than relying on God and using the gifts that he has given him. Do you see the difference? The perpetual challenge for the church today, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, at its infancy, for Israel, for everybody, is that we tend to rely on the gifts he gave us and use him, rather than relying on him and using the gifts he gave us. Which is why, in that sense, the church is in perpetual need of reformation. And if, by the way, you think that Protestant denominations are exempt from this process, then we're in a very, very dangerous position.
How can we convince non-believers that Christ was raised from the dead when it sounds so crazy?
Have you tried holding a gun to the head? No, sorry. Okay. There are a couple of things implied in this question. One is to do with worldview, and the worldview question is entirely appropriate. Now, there are two ways it could be taken. If you live in a culture which believes in UFOs, alien kidnappings, witchcraft, and everything else, actually, resurrections from the dead aren't a very big deal. What am I saying? It's another one of those things. Okay? Thankfully, it doesn't involve any form of probes. Now, if, however, what we're saying is that we have a scientific view, and I think this is more where the question is coming from, or what was assumed in the question, which basically says these things cannot happen because they are violations of the laws of nature. Until you can deal with that argument, these things cannot happen because they are violations of laws of nature, there is no evidence that you can introduce into the system to make them challenge that assumption. Now, again, I could say an awful lot about this. Let me try to be as brief as I can. Professor Stephen Hawking very recently came up with a book, I don't know if you saw it, I don't know if it was reported in the United States, saying that because we understand the law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Did that make a splash over here? In England, it was certainly front-page news for a while. And as a matter of fact, it was front-page news in England, then I got to Jakarta, it was front-page news in Jakarta, and then I went from Jakarta onto Hong Kong, and it was front-page news there. The book was being released as I sort of traveled around the world, which was great. It means I only needed one sermon for that trip. Now, the argument goes like this, and this is where it's fallacious. If we have an exhaustive understanding of the physical universe, which is governed by law, scientific law, miracles, therefore, cannot happen. Now, this is wrong. Now, it's a shame that, if you like, the refutation to this argument has been around for so long, but it's still not read. The laws of nature do not create anything or prevent anything. Okay? They describe. So the laws of arithmetic tell me that if I have two sweeties, and I take another two sweeties, and I put them together, I have 4. And I put them in my pocket. If the next time I go to get the sweeties out of my pocket, and I only have 3 sweeties, I do not conclude that the laws of mathematics have been broken. Okay? The laws of the land have been broken, and someone stole them from me. Probably the person sitting nearest me. Now, the fact that the mathematical laws are fixed and known is what allows me to detect outside influence that stepped in and reduced my sweetie count from 4 to 3. It is because we live in a universe where there are physical laws that we are able to detect abnormal events, especially miracles, because we know that they do not in the normal course of events. Look, if I take my sweetie and I throw it like this, okay? Almost hit them. Let me try again. And I throw it like this. Good catch. The laws of motion perfectly describe the parabolic curve of the trajectory of that sweet. Now, let's suppose I threw it and it stopped in midair. I wouldn't sit there saying, ooh, look, the law of gravity is being broken right now. The very fact it stopped in midair allows me to conclude that something is holding it up. Richard Dawkins made a comment a little while ago. He said, ask Christians about the virgin birth, they'll be deeply embarrassed by it. They have to admit that they believe in it, but in a scientific age, it's totally unbelievable. Look, virgin births in Mary's time were just as unlikely then as they are now. Mary understood this. We can deduce this from 2 factors. An angel appears to her, and first of all, she is scared. She doesn't go, ooh, an angel, like she's been greeted by some kind of strange fairy. Okay? She's actually scared. And 2, after the angel, in blazing glory, which you think would give it some degree of credibility, right? Says, you are pregnant. Her first response is, how can this be? She is not ignorant of the basic laws of biology. She understands that certain things need to take place before you have babies. If God miraculously implants within her a spermatozoon that fertilizes the egg, no laws of nature are broken, Once it is implanted, that egg proceeds to have a 9-month gestation and is born just like any other baby. The very fact that we understand the law in that instance allows us to tell whether there's been any outside interference in it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to figure it out. So, if your friend is wrestling with something like the resurrection on the basis that the laws of science cannot be broken, okay, they are confusing at that point two issues, law and agency. Look, Henry Ford built the first production line to build motor cars. The very fact that I can use physics and mathematics and various other scientific laws to 100% exhaustively, completely, totally and utterly explain the operation of that car and its assembly in no way tells us that once I have that exhaustive scientific knowledge that there was no Mr. Ford. It confuses law and agency. It's a category mistake, we'd say in philosophy. Just because you can give an exhaustive, 100% total explanation of this universe, even assuming that M theory is right, which is an interesting form of mathematics. So even if that is right, even if we could have an exhaustive, 100% mathematical model for the operation and function of the universe, even if that were possible, it would tell us nothing as to agency. Whether there was one who was behind it, who designed it. And that's part, I think, maybe what's going on there. That may be the debate, the conversation you need to have with your friend. Was that helpful? I hope it is.
Balance between predestination, and then they put in parentheses determinism. I'm assuming they are equating those. God has it all figured out already, and we pray that His will be done versus, quote, free will, and decisions I make influence my future.
Okay, so I think this is a question about free will and predestination, right? Did you choose to ask that question, or did God make you do it? Let me know and I'll get back to you. You want me to say more than that?
Huh? Go.
I don't know, I mean, I can say more than that if you want me to, but this is a complex question, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes people complain that I speak too quickly. Now, obviously, this is a criticism inspired by the devil. Now, what they're saying is there's insufficient time to process the thought. We are beings constrained in time. Okay, we process thought in time. We process life in time. When people say you're talking too quickly, they're saying there's insufficient time to process the thought. Now, let's supposing, with my watch, every time I stop it, time stops. So I push a button on my watch and time stops. What could you think at that point? What could you feel? What could you do? In the absence of time, we cannot do any of those things. We cannot even imagine what it is like to think in the absence of time, let alone to do it. However, we worship a God who exists in a set of living, loving relationships outside of time and as the author of space and time. Now, we know this is true because we live in a space-time continuum. Once again, I cite Star Trek as my authority. No space, no time. Which is why at several points in the New Testament it talks about God doing things before time itself began, which is a highly unusual phrase in the Greek because it doesn't exist in any form of Greek philosophy because everyone believed that the universe was eternal, that it didn't have a beginning. The classical Christian position has always been that there was a timeless eternity before creation, a timeless eternity after, and then in between this space-time continuum which we now currently are part of. But if you are worshipping the one who exists outside of space and time and is the author of space and time and sees all of space and time stretched out before him, and we can only understand life through the passage of time, the reason why the question is complicated is we're saying when the author of space and time itself actually steps in and we commune with him, what's actually happening at that point? So that's the question. And since that's not the question you asked me, why don't we take another one?
What would be the best way for the church to stem the flow of young people who are turning away from the faith because of questions that they have about Christianity that are, quote, answered, end quote, logically by prominent atheists? Or how do we best respond to a person's question about creation or miracles as they view them? And I can't make out the last three words, as in, you read that?
Oh, as in a fairy tale. Yeah? Is that right? As a fairy tale. Yeah, I have the gift of reading tongues. It's very helpful. Okay. We're going to have to get much better at dealing with questions as a church. I mean, we have to. First of all, we're going to have to get much better at allowing people to ask questions. I can remember speaking at a large conference, maybe, I can't remember how many years ago now, maybe 12 years, and they'd given me an hour and a half. Now, I know I overran today, but an hour and a half. I mean, even if a tongue of fire came down from heaven and rested on my head, I'm not interesting for an hour and a half. So I said, look, why don't I speak for 45 minutes, and I'll do 45 minutes of Q&A. And the organizer said, there were, I think, 4,000 people there. I said, just put microphones out in the audience and allow people to come up and ask questions. And the guy said, you can't do that. People could ask anything. I said, well, yeah, that's the point. The reason we're doing Q&A like this, by the way, is it's not some stunt. I just said, look, I don't want it to look like that everyone down here wrote questions. Does that make sense? We filtered through the ones that we liked the best, and we decided to answer them. The reason why Matt's drawing them out just randomly from the basket is, so there's no, if you like, we're not filtering the questions that are coming through. We have to allow people to ask questions. That's how you grow. That's how you learn. That's how you develop. So we must, one, get better at allowing people to ask questions. Then we must get, I think, a lot better at actually realizing the legitimacy behind an awful lot of questions. I mean, and there are some questions which are genuinely hard. Okay? The suffering one in particular that we've dealt with in 3 different ways is still very hard. And you may notice still the gaps that we still haven't addressed. Even the question about the last one that we were just having a bit of fun with about free will and predestination. That's hard. Those are deep questions. I would urge you not to bury those questions. If you bury those questions in your life, if you're a Christian, they will dig down underneath the ground, undermine you, and eventually your ground will collapse. That happens for a lot of people. Faith is not believing the things that you wish are true. Faith is always a response to truth and reality. Okay? The more sure you are of God's robustness, of His truth, of His veracity, the stronger your faith in Him. The less sure you are that He is real, true and so on, the weaker your faith in Him. That's why, wherever Christianity has grown historically, 3 things have always happened. Wherever there's been Christian revival, down through the centuries, 3 things you'll immediately see. Number 1, hospices are set up, or hospitals, to look after the sick. Number 2, an explosion of the arts, which is very, very, very interesting, and something we seem to have lost in the last little while, although I'm delighted to hear this church is so keen about the arts. And number 3, universities. Because if the Christian faith is true, you've got nothing to fear from difficult questions. You don't want people to ask you difficult questions unless you don't want people to ask you difficult questions unless you don't have the answer, you think there are no answers, or you're lying. Okay, those are the times we avoid questions. Oxford University, of which I'm a part, our motto is Dominus Illuminatia Mea, the Lord is my light. Now it's very interesting. Look it up online, the Oxford University Shield. We're not sure what it means. Some people are saying, actually, it doesn't mean what I think it means. The Oxford University Shield is an open book, okay, with the words Dominus Illuminatia Mea on them. The Lord is my light. 3 crowns and 7 seals coming off the book. Now let's just think about that imagery, shall we? An open book, 7 seals, 3 crowns, and a reference to God. I wonder what it could possibly be about. And even if you're not a Christian, if you've seen enough Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, you know we're talking about the book of Revelation. So we have to recover, does that make sense, that ability, that willingness for that kind of critical cross-examination. We have to recover it. There's nothing to hide. And so that's what we need to do. We have to invite these questions, welcome these questions. And I've got a very radical idea. Am I allowed to stand up just for a minute? Many people become Christians, and after their point of conversion, they develop a certain Christian knowledge. Does that make sense? Now, for most people, it seems to hover around somewhere between the age of 12 to 15. It sort of grows and then it stops there. Now, people go on to get degrees, they go on to their jobs, and if you're doing really well, okay, you acquire more and more professional knowledge in your area of expertise. Now, let's suppose that I come to you and you say, I'm a doctor, I'm a tax accountant, I'm a lawyer, and I say, hey, I want to set up in your business. Okay, I understand your business so well. You could ask me 2 questions, and within 35 seconds, you would know whether I have any idea what I'm talking about. Because your level of professional knowledge and insight into that area immediately allows to tell you whether I've got any clue what's going on. So our knowledge in the professional realm is going up this. Our knowledge about Christian things is stuck down here. And it becomes embarrassing. So we're in the boardroom, or we're in the law firm, and we're talking about law, and we give the most sophisticated, insightful answers. And then, all of a sudden, someone asks you about your faith, and we suddenly drop down to the level of the 12-year-old, and we feel embarrassed by it. It just doesn't, the gap is too big. So, come and study with us in Oxford. Or, go and do the, what's the program you have down here, the apologetics, what's it called?
One of the foundations,
the foundations course.
Yeah.
Do something to lift it up. There are the most incredibly profound answers. Mm-hmm. And they will deepen your faith and your walk with God incredibly.
Can I ask one more? And by the way, with that, the piggyback is so often people think that questions should only be asked by people who are not yet believers. That once you become a follower of Christ, questions are no longer allowed. That's actually when the best questions start. So do not stop asking them. I feel like and by the way, this has been a phenomenal time. I hate to say it's the last one. It is. There's a basket full. If you put your email address, we'll get to these. And Michael will be down afterwards. And there is more chocolate in here as well. I feel like I struggled with pride constantly. Is it just something that I have to give up to God every day and humble myself before Him? Or can I be delivered of this?
Wow. That's a good question. Well, I guess the starting point to say is at least you're aware of the issue, unless you're now taking pride in the fact that you've asked the question and you're aware of the issue, in which case it could be going the other way. It's very interesting how the Bible talks about we need to confess our sins one to another. Now, we don't do that, by the way, for forgiveness. You have to do that to be forgiven. We confess our sins to God to be forgiven. We confess our sins one to another for accountability and to deal with this issue of pride. I think pride is actually the number one killer. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite authors, I've quoted him several times already, C.S. Lewis, he actually, in one of his chapters, says that pride is actually the most foundational of all sins and is different from all other sins. And the fact that all the other sins, greed, lust, and so on, exist, if you like, for themselves. Does that make sense? Greed, you want more money. Lust, you want more whatever. Does that make sense? Pride, however, actually feeds everything else. Does that make sense? It's not something that exists in and of for itself. You don't satisfy it by getting more pride. So it just feeds, and therefore it is a bedrock. And that's why it needs to be dealt with. Now, I think there are moments of breakthrough in our life where God can break through in the most incredible way and deal with us in a certain way, or bring us to a certain point in our experience, which truly does humble us before Him, and we live, and we can live with it. So there are those moments. But I think the discipline of coming before Him every day is really important. For myself, I find it incredibly helpful, one, to have a group of people around me who aren't impressed by anything that I do and ask me all kinds of questions. Now I think about it, they're not very respectful people, actually. A loving wife who supports me in ways that I couldn't imagine. And just a short while ago, I said to her, if I married you, if I hadn't married you, I think my life would be a complete mess. And rather too quickly for comfort, she said, yes, you're right. And I think also constantly bringing us before God There's a very interesting prayer in the Old Testament. Lord, see if there's any wicked way in me. And you'll often find pride locked into those wicked ways at some level. And I think we have to keep bringing ourselves before him. But people are very good at spotting pride in our lives, by the way. Does that make sense? I mean, they are, generally speaking. They can see it. So the difficulty is, and I want to be careful how I phrase this, because this may be a good challenging point to end on, is we do actually need to be in the context of family for pride to really be properly managed. The trouble is that a lot of Christians, the way we deal with each other is, because it's not consistent with that fruit that I talked about earlier, we get ourselves into trouble. So I know I was having lunch with a group of pastors yesterday, and one of the things that, we were just saying, I remember saying was, look, if someone comes to you and says, I have to tell you the following truth and love, you can normally guarantee two things. Number one, it's rarely truthful. Number two, it is almost certainly not loving. Now, if they were telling you the truth in love, they wouldn't have to come to you and say, I'm about to tell you the following truth in love. Right? Because if they were speaking the truth in love, it would be obvious from the fact of what they were doing that they loved you, and they were telling something that was important for you to hear. So the very fact they have to flag it up, it's about to tell you that it's going to fall at both hurdles, 9 times out of 10. That's why I think it's so important that we have a love for the church and a desire to see it to be as strong and healthy as it can be. Because I actually need to be part of a church that's pushing itself on and going for greater things together in God, because it also helps me, keep me in check. Okay? And it helps my own heart to be challenged. I think it will be with us. Pride, I think, will rise up all the time. Every so often, God flicks the lights on, a bit more brightly, intensely, and you see a few more rats in the basement, so you can deal with them. So I don't know if you have. I'm sure Matt has some very useful ideas. But I'm going to sit back now and finish the chocolate.
Michael, it has been an incredible delight for us to be able to sit under your teaching, to experience both your heart and your mind. And we thank you very, very much for all that you have done for us this weekend. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, for everything. I really appreciate it.